Today I'll be talking about the film Waves from 2024 and specifically analysing how it mixes real historical events with fictional storytelling. Waves is a 2024 historical drama written and directed by Yuri Madl.
Yes, you got it, and sh there instead of sh, but it's all right. Okay.
The film takes place during one of the most dramatic turning points in Czech history, the Prague Spring of 1968 and its sudden end with the Warsaw Pact invasion. The key question I'm focusing on is where is the line between fact and fiction in the film, and a deeper question, is it lying or is it doing something meaningful by combining truth with fiction? So to understand the film, it's important to examine the real events of 1968, which form the backbone of its story. In January 1968, Alexander Dec.25 became the first secretary of the Communist Party and introduced a series of reforms intended to humanize socialism. These reforms loosened censorship and encouraged open discussion in society. Newspapers wrote critically again and students debated topics freely, and for many it felt like the country was operating properly for the first time in decades. There was a huge cultural revival in cafes, theatres and student clubs and radio programs. Young people in particular felt that the future could genuinely change. This sense of optimism is recreated in the early parts of the film. But this freedom had limits. From Moscow's perspective, a more open and democratic Czechoslovakia was a major threat, partly because it risked inspiring similar reforms in other socialist states. So although negotiations dragged on for months, the Soviet leadership ultimately decided that the experiment had to be stopped. And on August 20th to the 21st, armies from 5 Warsaw Pact countries invaded Czechoslovakia. Tanks rolled into the cities, borders closed, and the reforms were immediately halted. One of the first targets was Czechoslovakian radio, which had become a symbol of openness as it reported events independently and refused to follow Soviet instructions. During the invasion, radio journalists broadcast essential information to citizens, like where the tanks were and what was happening in the streets. Thousands of people formed human shields around the radio building and many were shot. This is the historical reality at the core of the film, and it doesn't exaggerate this moment. Understanding this helps to evaluate how the film treats fact and fiction. So although it's a modern film, Waves tries to recreate the atmosphere of 1968. It focuses on journalists and ordinary people who were caught in this event rather than politicians or generals. While the film is inspired by real radio journalists, the main characters are fictional. The newsroom they work in resembles the real international desk of Czech radio, but the relationships, colleagues, and conflicts are invented to build narrative. The plot follows Tomas, who unexpectedly joins the international newsroom. His younger brother Pavel is a student activist representing the youth movements of the time. The state security create a major conflict in the film as they pressure Tomas into becoming an informant for them. This echoes real aspects of life in communist Czechoslovakia, so while Tomas's situation is fictional, the dynamic is historically accurate. During the invasion, the radio suddenly becomes very important. Phones stop working and the newspapers can't print, but radio waves still reach millions of people. Tomas faces a choice. Does he cooperate with state security or protect him and his brother? Or does he broadcast the truth? The climax revolves around him helping to maintain an uncensored signal during the invasion, aware of the danger. So, what is historical? Looking at the factual side, the major events, like the Prague Spring reforms and the invasion and the attack on the radio building, are all portrayed accurately. The atmosphere of the period is also well captured. The enthusiasm of early 1968, the uncertainty, the rumours, and then the shock and the grief in August. The film is also accurate in showing how important radio was. Journalists really did refuse to obey Soviet orders and kept broadcasting even while their building was occupied. As well as this, many of the announcements in the film have direct historical relevancy. What is fictional? Tomas and Pavel are not based on specific individuals. Their conversations, friendships, and personal dilemmas were invented by the screenwriter. Scenes of confrontation, like Tomas being pressured by state security, are plausible but dramatized to make the story emotionally engaging. The timeline is also compressed. In reality, events unfolded over days and weeks, but in the films, things happened faster for dramatic effect. which is common in historical cinema and isn't necessarily misleading as long as major events are unchanged. So the big picture is historically accurate, but the individual storylines are fictional. So does the film lie? If lying is defined as deliberately distorting real events or presenting something false as true, then no, it does not lie. The film doesn't claim to be a documentary as it's a historical drama, and the film never states that Tomas and Pavel are real people. It aims for an emotional truth and a sense of what it felt like to live through this moment in time. The film also avoids altering major historical facts. It doesn't suggest the invasion happened differently, or that the resistance at the radio station was more successful than it was. Instead, it dramatizes personal experiences that could have happened without rewriting history. So, what does this approach of blending fact and fiction achieve? One reason is that fictional characters allow the film to explore real human dilemmas like fear, loyalty, and responsibility in a way that is relatable. Real historical figures can sometimes feel complicated, while fictional characters can represent broader social experiences. And another reason is emotional engagement. History could feel distant or abstract to some audiences, but by following Tomas and Pavel, you can invest emotionally in people's lives and therefore better understand the stakes of the historical moment. Mixing fact and fiction also reveals complexities that factual accounts could struggle to capture. History books will tell you what happened, but films like this help to imagine how it felt. All of these factors can make history more accessible, and for many viewers outside the Czech Republic, this film may be their first introduction to the Prague Spring, so through storytelling, the film preserves historical memory. Though this approach does come with some limitations and risks. One risk is that viewers may assume these fictional characters were real, which could slightly blur the line between reality and invention. Another limitation is simplification. The Prague Spring was a complex political event involving students, writers, politicians, and workers. The film focuses mainly on a small group of radio workers, giving an intimate view but leaving out other key aspects. The film could also project modern values and ideas about journalism onto a past society, which isn't necessarily bad, but is important to recognize. These limitations don't undermine the film, but they remind us to watch historical dramas critically and thoughtfully. So to conclude, Waves draws a clear line between fact and fiction. The historical backdrop is accurate and the fictional elements serve as a lens for the audience to emotionally connect with the period. The film isn't lying, but using fiction to reveal deeper truths, which not only allows us to reflect on 1968, but also the role of truth and the media and society. The line lies somewhere between real historical framework and fictional individual story, though both sides work together to communicate a deeper understanding of freedom, repression, and human resilience.
Thank you very much. Thank you. Right. Very good presentation. Thank you. Let me take over for a bit, and maybe we can talk about a little bit what you think. Maybe because you may not agree with me. Very, very brilliant presentation as usual, with all the sort of historical references, pictures, and everything. I have one query or criticism. I don't know. My criticism of the film, or the question whether the film is lying, wasn't, maybe it didn't make this sufficiently clear, wasn't about the Prague Spring of '68. The film, as you will see tomorrow, covers a year from September '67, you know, with those student demonstrations, because there were these power cuts at their halls of residence, and they kind of demonstrated chanting "We want light," and the police thought that this was kind of "We want enlightenment, not electricity," and beat them up. And the film presents this as though my main criticism is, if I may say so, well, to begin with, when Prague Spring begins, it's perfectly authentic. And actually, this film was premiered at this Karlovy Vary Film Festival last July 2024, and then it was released into the cinemas for the anniversary of the Soviet invasion in August '68. And actually, it was incredibly successful, like millions of people went to see it and people cried, and I don't know if you see it tomorrow, I don't know whether you want to cry, but it is true that the scenes of that first week of the Soviet invasion, when the kind of leadership of the Communist Party was kidnapped by the Russians to Moscow, and then the president went there and persuaded them to release them, and then so the first week was a totally orgiastic kind of week. This 24 hours broadcasting. Russians didn't manage to actually control that radio station, because after they occupied the main radio station, the journalists moved into a secret kind of location which was ready for the invasion from the west, right? So they broadcast absolutely uninterrupted for 24 hours, and they were real heroes. This is all fine, but the problem that I kind of have and have had for quite some time, people don't really understand what was happening during the Prague Spring of '68. Well, it's got sort of 70 years or even more, whatever, that it happened, and who remembers it? 70 years, 50 years must be. Basically what everything kind of, this is for historians maybe quite interesting, what I'm hopefully trying to say, how historical events get kind of shrink into kind of simple, simply digestible kind of situation. So obviously it's very, very understandable. On the 21st of August of '68, Soviet armies invaded, and this was an outrage, and everybody kind of remembers it every year. What preceded over those kind of months from January '68 until that invasion was kind of much more difficult to define. And it was mostly, again, a media orgy, everything sort of discussing in public about the crimes of the Stalinist regime in the 50s, and mostly victims being kind of featured in the radio. And as there's an interview that I have with former first post-communist Czechoslovak Prime Minister Pithard, who says, yeah, well, it was just talk, nothing was really achieved. But my criticism is that the 60s were incredibly liberal, as I have tried to demonstrate, amongst other things, by the incredibly anti-communist liberal films made in the 60s. And there is this interesting point. Yes, you rightly pointed out that this film is a work of fiction, and they introduced for dramatic sort of reasons this sort of blackmail of that young man who's sent into the radio station to spy upon those sort of absolutely free and courageous journalists. And my question is whether the secret police in '68 was this powerful. And I would say no. And I would say that for now, Mardel is about 40. You saw him holding this mobile. That was the director in the last picture that you showed in your presentation. And actually they kind of sort of think, okay, it was communism, it was totally criminal and oppressive, and so it must have been oppressive before the Prague Spring started. And also we've got on Moodle, there's a criticism of this film by the French historian Muriel Blake, who's saying actually when you start watching the film, it starts with some kind of unclear kind of video that the communists killed millions of people or something like that, which is absolutely, it doesn't say when, doesn't say where. The communists under Stalinism did kill unjustly about 250 people, not thousands, not millions. So this is kind of manipulative. And this notion that everything, that the autumn of, now there is this thing that when this student demonstration occurred in September '67, a year before the Prague Spring, there is this kind of conflict in the radio station because those courageous journalists do not want to broadcast some official statement lying about how the students were destructive in the streets or whatever. And the film actually says that all the media published condemned the students. I absolutely don't think this is possible, right? Because the media in the 60s were so incredibly varied that so in this sense, I think it creates this illusion that because there was communism, it was still oppressive. And basically, I don't think in the 60s it was, right? And then of course, what happens? there is oppression, oppression, oppression. People are blackmailed to be sort of sent to the radio to spy on the journalists. And then suddenly there's a sort of, in January 68, there's a deus ex machina, and Dubček, the liberal communist leader, is appointed, and suddenly everything is free. And then it's totally unmotivated. And it doesn't actually explain how this has happened. So this is basically my criticism, not the criticism of what the film describes around 68. Now, I don't know, what do you think? Now, your argument, and actually when I wrote about this, my first review in July last year, saying that basically I think that kind of for the dramatic effect created this hostile communist regime in the 60s, which it didn't exist. Somebody, right, like you, under it, and I've translated it, it's on Moodle, maybe you looked at it, basically said, well, for this is a work of fiction, not a documentary, and for fiction, you certainly can make changes, and you can introduce a fictional element of this non-existent student who is blackmailed to spy on the people in the radio. And also the argument was, it is quite good that this is kind of brought into the public's attention, and it certainly did, because as I'm saying, people were crying. What do you think? Is this a distortion of history or not? As historians, is it okay for dramatic effect, to have a dramatic archway, as you said, to kind of introduce sort of hostile elements so that there is proper conflict in the film? Maybe if they made a film said that the autumn of 67 was totally liberal, and then actually it exploded and everybody was even more liberal, there probably wouldn't be a film in it. Until the very dramatic scenes with the Soviet invasion. Anyway, I think it's an interesting point, especially since so many people were actually interested, because I suppose even after those sort of decades, that invasion is still a trauma. And it's interesting that people were so interested, but at the same time also there is this pervasive propaganda in the Czech Republic that communism was an absolute evil. And they do not distinguish that there were actually some sort of so-called reformist communists that were trying to liberalize it, were quite successful in the 60s. Anyway, that's enough. Over to you. Okay.
Did you see my email then?
What?
My email about leaving a bit early. Is that okay?
Oh, I didn't see it yet. Okay, I'll react whenever I get around to it.
No, it's just today, because I've got work after this.
Oh, the fine. Oh,
But I can-
oh, yeah, you have to leave. Yeah. You said you have to leave. Okay,
Yeah.
off you go.
No, I don't feel no.
All right. I thought you were a girl. Okay, obviously not. Confused, ancient lecturer. Right? Okay. Didn't read it properly. Sorry. Yes. I so hate these verifications. It's so unnecessary. They started this now with photocopying in the department. You have to double verification to just photocopy a bloody piece of paper. It's absolutely ridiculous. Thank you.
Okay. I'm doing my presentation on something like happiness, in particular what it said about post-communist Czech society. So something like happiness was released in 2005. It was directed by Bodin Slama. Follows the journey of three friends trying to survive in a very difficult economic situation and environment, and just trying to find happiness where they can. It was quite a critical darling. Not only did it win multiple domestic awards, but also won a Golden Seashell at the 2005 San Sebastian Film Festival, which is like the best film put up for nomination that year. Just a bit of background, the revolution happened in 1989, the Velvet Revolution, and upon the eve of this, there was a hold on about what people wanted out of it. 45% wanted socialism still, 47%, so the majority here wanted a sort of hybrid socialist capitalist system, and only 3% actually wanted capitalism imposed upon them. But this was obviously not entirely what happened. Early hope for these sort of large, ambitious reforms for a sort of capitalist utopian hybrid society were quickly thwarted. This started first with the sort of shock therapy privatisation, just large sweeping capitalist reforms all happening at once, sort of shaking the society, and the implementation of venture capitalism, which essentially took all the shares that the government owned in these companies and handed them out to share tickets to people to invest in them. This allowed for a very fast transition, but there were problems with like swindlers and corruption and whatnot. For example, in the case of Victor Krzyzewski, he started a firm called, I think it was Harvard Capitalist Investments, where he took thousands of people's tickets and promised them a 1,000% guarantee on the return, and then smuggled all the money away in private islands, and so you had things like this happening around the time. By 1997, a lot of the optimism for this capitalist system and the sort of ambition for the revolution is weakened, and after sort of massive economic downturn due to essentially they didn't have enough foreign money in the reserve to keep their fixed exchange rate, and so their koruna massively devalued. All currency in the country was, greatly declining in worth, and eventually, after another political crisis in which I think it was the OSD tried to oust their current political leader amongst revelations of sort of illegal donations to the party and whatnot, they had to impose an interim government, and everything was on fire. This sort of difficult situation is depicted quickly in the film. You see the communist house and blocks filled with rows and rows of people, kind of run down and whatnot. The farmhouse is in disarray, the factories impose upon the landscape, and the father of Monica being unemployed for a long time, while sort of mirroring the real life reality in these industrial areas such as Northern Bohemia. In the public memory, a lot of Czechs view the post-communist era as a lot worse quality of life-wise than the previous one. Only 45% of respondents in a CVVM poll in 2009 thought it was better. Now there are reasons for that. Obviously there was the crash in 97, which led to a lot of unemployment after what was considered for a long time a pretty successful transition from the Czech government. You can see it going from 3.5% in 1993 to 9.9% in 1999, which is a massive downturn. In 2008, just before this poll was done, there was obviously the housing crash starting in America, which affected the global economy. So unemployment rose again to 8.7%. So there was a lot of this sort of hatred for not being able to work. And when you consider previously under communism, I believe it was a law that you had to have a job. You weren't allowed to be unemployed, or at least they did everything to ensure you weren't. This was a sort of sharp downturn for them. When it comes to the character in the film, the main sort of heart and soul of the film is Tonic. He's described mainly by Monica's dad as a very kind-hearted man, and it shows in his actions. He takes care of the kids, he lives with Anne, tries to look after her and rebuild the farmhouse. But one of the big criticisms of his character is he's incredibly passive. While he does live out his ideals, he doesn't really fight for them. He repeatedly tells Monica to go away to America. He doesn't fight for her in any way. And he doesn't fight to keep the kids either. He rejects the sort of capitalist idea of careerism. He mostly focuses on caring for those in his life, his family, and community. He refuses to work at the factory even though he's been offered to. He finds it important to keep up the farmhouse. Now this farmhouse symbolic of Czech national identity. In an interview, the director did say he doesn't agree to this. This wasn't what he's intending, but definitely the artist being what it is, I think it's important to note that you can view it as a sort of symbol for this national identity. It's sort of run down in each appear, and very few people are willing to look for it. It's tied to his heritage very deeply, yet his family doesn't seem to care. He's sort of fighting to keep it afloat. And at the very end, obviously, he sells the farmhouse, which could be
When the director says in that interview, oh, it isn't a metaphor or whatever, it is actually quite interesting that he actually he couldn't really say yes, of course it's a metaphor of national identity, because he would pin it down, right? That film, and he obviously has to fight against people sort of putting sort of labels of meaning on the various motives of the film. So I suppose that's what the reaction is. It doesn't mean that he doesn't think it is. But he can't obviously say the openly is by theory about it.
It's open to interpretation.
Yeah, all right.
And then he loses almost everything. The woman he loves leaves, his aunt who he's been staying with dies, and he's told to sell the farmhouse by his aunt. And he does so. The sort of globalist economy comes in, takes it over, sort of signifying the threat to the Czech national identity from global forces, and then the movie disappears. The other sort of primary character is Monica. She comes across as very good-natured. She looks after the kids and whatnot, but she is incredibly indecisive throughout the movie. Mostly when it comes to the idea of emigration. She's kind of been pulled in multiple directions. Her father doesn't want her to go, though he's not too explicit about it with her. It's very evident. And her mother's pushing her constantly to go. She's also kept back by multiple personal incidents in life, mainly with Dasha and the kids having to be taken care of. And then by the end of the movie, she comes back to Czech Republic, and she wants to find Tonic again, and he's nowhere to be found. And you can see her on the train, saying that finding more comfort in the contemporary simple aspects of the Czech life compared to the American sort of ambitious one. And then I suppose you would call them the antagonists of this movie, Yara and Dasha. Dasha as a character, Yara as a character is, I think the word I heard you describe him was a yuppie. He's very focused on his work, he puts it as great importance, he's not hyper-capitalist, but he's very, emphasising this sort of line. He's married but has multiple affairs, most prominently with Dasha obviously, but also with multiple other women. And even after he moves into Dasha's house, after Dasha's been taken to the mental hospital, he refuses to care for the kids in any way because he wants to use it as a sort of bachelor pad. Dasha, on the other hand, is severely mentally ill throughout the movie. She's struggling, her life is falling apart around her, and she doesn't seem to be doing anything to try and fix it. She's narcissistic. Everything in the movie is always about her whenever she's involved. She doesn't care for other people or what they're doing. She frequently lashes out, especially at Monica. She's paranoid, particularly with Monica again. She's accusing her constantly of sleeping with Yara, and trying to steal the kids, things like this. And her character shows a lot of lack of support from the institutions that were in place at the time. She can't take care of the kids, there's no food in the house, it's a mess, and yet they're sort of just left stuck there, and it's the people around them who've got to pick up the slack. The key aspect for this film, from what I've heard and read, is this sort of idea of natural life versus modernity that is prevalent in a lot of this director's films. You can see this when the farmhouse at the end is destroyed by the factory. It's sort of this idealist explanation or sort of symbol of a sort of farm life with nature, living as simplistically, being overtaken by the industrial global forces. You can see in this lake scene, you're out sort of on the lake, it's peaceful, you're with the kids, and you've got these big looming factories in the background. And then towards the end of the movie, when Dasha's been away in the mental hospital, she's left the kids in the care of Tonic and Monica, and they're hosting a party for them, and they drive up in their 4x4 truck and take them away, sort of rollicking up onto the simple life they were leading and robbing it from them. And then there's also the ending of the film. Monica's on the train looking for Tonic, not really any specific destination in mind, and she looks out the window and she sees people living a simple life and the dog running up, but the dog can't keep up the train goes on anyway, so the global forces will always keep moving, and the natural life can't really keep up with that. And there's also this Monica's father versus mother thing. Monica's father seems to really hold to heart this idea of good people doing good things. He's a sort of victim of the unemployment. He finds himself a great failure in that, and most of his days drinking, sitting there quite a lot. And he doesn't want her to leave, he wants her to stay here and be with Tonic. But her mother is more of the sort of capitalist mindset where she's got to make something of herself, be happy, be stable. And maybe that's, from her past experience with the father going so poorly. So So some of the changes in Czech society you can see through the process in this movie. You've got this capitalist individualism represented in some of the characters previously mentioned, replacing more collective security structures, more sort of family-oriented community environments that could hold each other to account and protect each other. There's Monica's mother pushing for immigration and stable income, reflecting the new logic of self-advancement. This ties into the celebration of immigration. There's this new idea with the introduction of the West that you've got to make something yourself, you've got to go out, get a job, make money. And the immigration, moving to America, coming from a former Soviet country, is a massive discrepancy in what was once believed and what is now. The emotional bond becomes home mechanisms. They've got to, when the kids are left all alone, there's no one coming to take them. They can't go into a home, but don't know how that will go. Dash is a mess, and it's up to her friends to try and make sure she's okay. There are some, what I'd describe as more good things though. One of the key aspects of this is the camera that comes from Japan that Dad gets at Christmas. Now, he's very thrilled with this. That maybe you could argue there is a sort of idea that it's technology infringing upon a sort of private, personal moment. But it seems to be presented well in the movie, so that's how I'm taking it. And there's also a sort of introduction to Western culture. You can do this with the sort of punk subculture at the beginning of the movie being shown, which wouldn't have existed prior. And conclusion. The film is particularly the capitalist transition, showing the sort of poverty that it's led to and the inequality. Disillusionment for work security. People are unemployed, they're not living good lives. They've got nothing to go for in Czech Republic, so they're choosing to move away, or at least they feel like they're going. And then it offers community. The most important thing is the director really wants to emphasise this point that it's human connection that is the best way to find happiness. You've got to act with humanness, you've got to be nice, kind to your neighbours, focus on personal connections over the sort of capitalist modern world where you've got to make something yourself. And then, that's me.
Questions? My total failure to make students ask questions and shout at presenters. Pity. All right. Thank you very much. It was good. Thank you. Let's see what the time is. 40, that's quite a lot. So, okay, so just very briefly, we'll see that film Waves tomorrow. Just wanted to say, okay, I sort of clogged this course with many films from the 60s because I thought they were really quite sort of elucidating, sort of informative about that part of those 40 years. And then, of course, at the end, we've got these 3 films from post-communist times. And I was just thinking, as you were doing this presentation, that they have actually dealt with 3 important aspects of post-communism. Now, this film, something like Happiness, is already 20 years old. It's incredible, really. But nevertheless, Slama was the first film director who started actually looking at these problems of destitution. Nobody was really doing it before, so this is maybe quite important that it deals with the sort of dissatisfaction and the fact that the situation of the people didn't really, especially outside Prague, they didn't really change so much. I have to say, one can be quite critical of kind of the economic state of the Czech Republic after the fall of communism. Obviously, now 36 years later, that country is much, much richer than it ever was under communism. However, there's a lot of inequality. It is very similar to what happens in Britain and how actually it destabilizes society when kind of the richest 5% of the population sort of hoard most wealth, and there are people who don't have money for food or whatever. So that isn't very good. So criticism of the social insufficiencies, problems in post-communist society was one topic. The other topic was this film Owners, where it actually criticizes the present, how lack of community spirit and selfishness and idiocy and being an uninformed voter basically destabilizes democracy, and that doesn't only apply to the Czech Republic, because as I'm saying, there is things emerge together. These countries are sort of East and West are becoming very similar. And finally, looking at the past. And this was the film Waves, where it actually zooms in on sort of major events in that sort of Czechoslovak history. But on the other hand, I would actually argue that it fictitiously, for maybe dramatic reasons, slightly distorts things that maybe are too complicated when you study them as a proper historian. So that is everything. There will be one more film tomorrow, as I'm saying, those Waves. It is an interesting, it is eminently watchable film, so do come. About your essays, now you're supposed to get them back, as I sort of promised on Moodle on Thursday. I am about 2/3 way through it, and I don't know whether I will manage it by Thursday, but I will certainly manage it by Friday or by the end of the week. So you'll get them back and they are all right, as I would say. I haven't actually come across anything that would be badly written. So I haven't done all of them. So that you will have them back in time to have a look at it before you do the second essay. And thank you very much. Yes, okay. So it's okay. Thank you.